Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Jack Stern and Spencer Michaelis coming to you from Brewer Fanatic, recapping all things Brewers. Spencer, the times have not been great lately. It's been a rough start to the month of September for the Milwaukee Brewers. They dropped each of their first two series in the month. They dropped their first game of the month as well, wrapping up that series in Cincinnati. But some more tough times that we're going to be going over here tonight. Milwaukee wrapping up a losing homestand by dropping a series with the Rockies. As of this recording, they are about an hour and a half out from beginning the rubber match in San Francisco. MLB schedule makers scheduling this one for a nighttime getaway game. So kind of complicates our recording schedule a little bit. I wish the corporate overlords at MLB HQ would really think about the little guy a little bit more. But
yeah,
we'll play the cards we're dealt, so we're not going to have anything for you on the final game of that series, so we can't recap the entire Giants series. But we'll quickly go over everything that has transpired over the last week since our last episode, and then we'll just kind of break down some storylines, different observations that stood out to us. We'll try to take some listener questions. We're changing up the structure of the program just a little bit this week in an effort to try to get to more questions and get to more analysis. I think that's something that we could probably do a little bit of a better job of than we have so far. We don't want to waste people's time. We want to get into the meat of the program and spend as much time there as we can. But without further ado, we can jump right into it. I'm not even going to ask Spencer how he's doing tonight because that's how on the ball I want to be tonight. I want to get through this. We don't have time. But we do have some time to, first of all, talk about this series against the Rockies. As I said, Milwaukee dropping 2 out of those 3 games at home. Game 1, Rockies 3, Brewers 2. Frankie Montas got the ball in this one. He took a no-hitter into the 6th inning, recorded the first out of the 6th inning, and then it was broken up. Unfortunately, Michael Tolio would hit a go-ahead 3-run home run in that inning, which would end up being the deciding run in this one. The Brewers did technically out-hit the Rockies 4-3, but when your 4 hits are singles and one of those 3 hits for the Rockies is a 3-run home run, that's the way that things are going to break for you. Game 2, the Brewers did bounce back to win this one. 5-2, this final score in this one. Tobias Myers with arguably the best start of his career. I know he's gone 8 innings a couple times this year, but 6 innings in this one, 4 hits, just 1 run allowed on a solo homer, 1 walk, 11 strikeouts for him, which was a career high. The fastball was excellent. Ton of whiffs with that pitch. I believe his whiff rate was around 60% on that pitch. I'm going off the top of my head here, but he was getting a lot of swing and miss with that pitch. So he did a really nice job, one of the best outings of his career. Meanwhile, the Brewers hitting 3 home runs against Rockies starter Ty Block. Willie Adames and Gary Sanchez going back-to-back in the first inning. William Contreras adding on in the third with a home run. So really the only well-played game for the Brewers of this series all around. Game 3, they would once again end up back in the losing column 4-1. Rockies taking this one for the series. And really the story in this one was 23 straight Brewers hitters retired to end the game. The last base runner Milwaukee had was in the 2nd inning when Isaac Collins, who had been promoted to the big leagues earlier that day, was making his MLB debut in left field. In his first MLB plate appearance in that 2nd inning, he recorded a base hit, stole second base. That was the last base runner that the Brewers would have in this one. Kyle Freeland and the bullpen really had their number. The theme in this one, just a lot of softly hit fly balls. The Brewers were under everything against Kyle Freeland. And when you're hitting routine fly balls, that's arguably the least the least productive contact that you can make, because those are almost automatic outs at that point. You know, fly balls are interesting to look at because depending on how well you hit the fly ball, there's a wide range of how productive that can be compared to other types of batted balls. If you get into a ball in the air, the numbers are going to be very good because those are always going to be extra bases, home runs. You're not really getting into that fly ball. It's almost a completely useless kind of contact because that ball's in the air for a while. Guys are going to have time to run it down. That ball's getting caught. That's what happened a lot in this game. Freddie Peralta, not a deep start for him. He was pulled with 2 outs in the 5th. 86 pitches, I believe, is the pitch count that he was at that point. I didn't write it down, but he was not happy about being pulled at that point in the game. And you could kind of tell in his body language during postgame and the way that he answered some questions that he was not thrilled that Pat Murphy chose to go to the bullpen there. Probably doesn't help that Hobie Milner comes in to face the left-handed Sam Hilliard. First batter, 3-run home run, breaking a tie, settling that score at 4-1, which would be the final in this one. So a rough series for the Brewers at home, a rough homestand for them at home overall. The Brewers then going to San Francisco for this Giants series. The Brewers took game 1. It was a close one, 3-2. Aaron Civale with some good work for the Brewers. A little bit of a quicker hook for him as well. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Garrett Mitchell hitting a solo home run off Tristan Beck in the 6th inning. That would end up being the game-winning run for the Brewers. It may not have necessarily been the game-winning run if not for a controversial call at home plate. So Joey Ortiz, play at the plate, head first slide, and it just to start with the call on the field is he was ruled out. If you go back and look at the replay, essentially what happens is Ortiz kind of straddles the base, so to speak, with his arms and with his hands, and the pitcher drops the tag essentially right on the center of the base, on the center of home plate. And as I was watching this go down and watching the replay, my immediate thought was he's safe, but they're going to say there's not enough evidence to overturn it. It's exactly what happened. And I think they got it wrong. Spencer, I can get your thoughts on this as well. But basically what happened was Ortiz slid in, pitcher tags the middle of the plate, didn't touch him. By the time he moves that glove to get up and get Ortiz in, I believe it was like the forearm area that he actually made contact with him, like definitive contact. By that point, Ortiz had his left hand in, but the umpires in New York ruling that there wasn't enough evidence to overturn.
Yeah, it's one of those things where this is my biggest issue with replay in all sports, honestly, is this the saying is always you have to be 100% sure to overturn it. And that means that when they look at it, if they can come up with any sort of doubt, then they're going to use that as a reason to not overturn it. And it happens in football all the time. It happens in basketball even. But in baseball, it's very noticeable, and especially on tag plays, because they will always be able to argue, other than the super obvious ones, that, well, we can't really tell if the glove clipped him from that angle. It doesn't look like it, but we can't tell. And I think that was basically the gist of this one. It was, I think he might have even got him up higher on the arm when he finally made contact. It might have been closer to like the tricep area when he finally got the glove on him. And it just, it felt really obvious to me that he was safe, but I agreed with Jack. Jack texted me and said, they're not going to overturn this. And I agreed in the moment. I didn't think they would overturn it. It kind of sucks when you know that's going to happen as a baseball fan. Like, you know that, okay, this call was almost certainly wrong, but you also know it doesn't matter because it's probably just going to stand anyway. And it's not a fun spot to be in as a fan. And I wish they would give a little bit of leeway on the ability to change calls and say, we can use some logic, just like they did when they made the call on the field, and say, hey, no, we can't 100% tell if he might have clipped his arm, but if we were recalling it with this view, we'd call him safe. I think that type of ability for the umpires in New York might be something that would help, and I think fans would appreciate a little bit more, but I also don't think we'll ever see it, because I do get the general idea of saying, hey, we need to know for sure if we're going to overrule the people on the field. So it's just a weird spot to be in, but I do think they got it wrong in the end.
Ultimately didn't end up mattering. The Brewers hanging on to win game 1. Game 1, like I said, was a tight one. Game 2 was not. Brewers dropping this one 13-2, and really the only story from this one was the worst start of Colin Rea's career. 10 runs allowed in 4 innings of work. He gave up 3 home runs. I think he only had like 6 swings and misses. The Giants were tagging him pretty good, and we'll talk about this in about a minute here because it's one of the main storylines that we're going to walk through here after this quick recap. But just the long ball hurting Colin Rea again. I think we can kind of go through and maybe dissect each of these home runs. The wind was blowing out in San Francisco, playing off the bay. And like, we'll get to it, but I do think that was part of it. But no matter how you slice it, Colin Rea was hit hard in this one. Not good stuff for him. Game 3, like we mentioned, that game will be starting most likely a few minutes after we wrap up with recording this episode, so we won't have anything for you on that one. But the Brewers are playing the rubber match, going for the series win here, trying to win their first series in September. You all will know whether or not that happened by the time this comes out. Fortunately, we won't have anything for you regarding that game on this program. But with that quick recap out of the way, we can kind of jump into just some bigger storylines for the week or some things that stood out to us, things that we want to kind of break down a little bit, and questions from all of you guys as well that we want to break down for you. Like I said, we'll start with Colin Rea because that's really the story that's on everybody's mind right now. We were at a point a little over a month ago now, or about a month ago, where he was actually still trending up. Like, you were getting into the dog days of summer, and I think that's kind of a point where you wouldn't be surprised to see a guy hit a little bit of a swoon. He was getting better. Like, he was continuing to make adjustments, striking more guys out. Like, there were signs there that, you know, we talked throughout the year about how, you know, with kind of trying to look at some of the peripherals, also factor in the Brewers defense behind it, but just try to isolate, or not isolate, but just try to weigh all these different factors that go into what makes Colin Rea. And we had been saying odds are he's probably still going to finish the season with an ERA north of 4. It is north of 4 now after this outing. But then you kind of go forward a couple of weeks and you're getting to the point where, okay, we're getting into late August here, and he's getting better and the peripherals are getting better, and he's made some mechanical tweaks to get some of that deception back. And then things really got rough for him over these last 6 starts. And kind of the way you can break this down, well, first I'll read off the numbers for you. So these last 6 starts for Colin Rea: a 7.39 ERA, a 6.84 FIP, and that includes that outing against Cleveland where he went 7 shutouts and flirted with a no-hit bid. So you kind of break each of these starts down. He got hit very hard by the Dodgers, obviously hit very hard by the Giants. Those are really the 2 not good ones at all. And it is alarming when you have 2 blowups in a 6-start span. I think if it was just one of these outings, the narrative changes quite a bit. But to have 2 of them so close together, like, it gets a little bit harder to write them off as a blip on the radar. You then have the Cleveland start where he was fantastic. And then just about every other start in between has largely been okay. They looked a lot like 2023 Colin Rea, these other outings now. I think that one in Oakland, you could still make a case he did pretty well. I think he was left in too long during that Oakland outing because he came back out for the 7th inning, and I believe he gave up, was it like another double or something, and then the inherited run came around to score off a Koenig.
Yeah.
So if you take him out, if you don't bring him out for the 7th in that one, that also looks like a pretty good outing. But other than that, then I believe the remaining 2 are kind of these 4 innings, 2 earned runs. There might have been a 4-inning, 3 earned run. I think that's what the Cincinnati one was. So basically you're looking at 2 just terrible outings, 2 nightmarish outings, 1 really good one, and then the rest are just kind of in the middle a little bit. But really the theme here where you can tie most of these struggles back to is it's the home runs. He's given up 11 home runs now in these last 6 starts. He didn't give up any in that Cleveland one. I believe every other start, though, he's given up multiple home runs during this stretch. He gave up 3 in San Francisco. He gave up 4 to the Dodgers, gave up 2 in that Oakland start, 2 in that Red start. So, yeah, that's the problem for him right now. It's the long ball. And interestingly enough, you look at some of these home runs, most of them have been legitimately hit hard, but it's weird because most of the loud, like his overall hard hit rate and the quality contact isn't actually a whole lot worse than it's been for most of the year. It's just that the majority of the hard hit balls are now in the air and they're leaving the yard. So it's kind of a matter of how exactly do you process that? And I went and I looked at each of these home runs. Basically, the only one that kind of seemed like a cheap shot, so to speak, was the Mike Yastrzemski home run in San Francisco on Wednesday night. That one was hit like 94 miles an hour. It barely squeaked out to right. You could tell that was one that he just got it up and it kind of got caught in the jet stream and it kind of floated it out there. I mean, the pitch probably got a little too much of the white of the plate, but it was a sweeper below the strike zone and he just kind of went down and stabbed at it and was just kind of able to lift it out and get it caught in the wind. The other 2 home runs were legitimately hit pretty hard. And the ones against the Dodgers were smoked. I looked at all those. So it's at an interesting juncture now where it is kind of like how do you process that? There's a couple different things you can say about it. Number one, you can obviously be alarmed that he's just giving up this many moonshots. Number 2, you can also take a step back and say, well, what are the odds that so much of the loud contact is going to continue to go for home runs? Because remember, for much of the year, he was giving up some loud contact and it was finding gloves more. But even if you want to say he was due for regression there, these are batted balls that you're talking singles, doubles instead of being outs, not all of them becoming home runs. So it's an interesting kind of way to process this. Like if you look at his xFIP during this stretch, it's still only like 4.2 or something. I'm not really a big xFIP guy because xFIP just kind of assumes that, well, it's not meant to assume it, but essentially what it ends up doing is it ends up treating every fly ball as if it's similar because it's just going to apply the league average home run to fly ball ratio to the number of fly balls you allowed. I don't really buy that because not every fly ball is created equally. Like if you're giving up really well struck fly balls, that doesn't mean you're unlucky when more of them are clearing the fence. But I guess I'm kind of rambling a little bit here and I can turn it over to you for your thoughts. But basically the bottom line here is the real difference for Colin Rea is just the amount of loud contact that's leaving the yard now compared to what we saw before. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on this or if you've looked into it at all.
I haven't looked into it as deep as you, but just kind of based off of what you're talking about here, it is weird because, like you said, all of a sudden, all the hard contact being in the air, just I haven't watched the videos. I haven't looked back at them. I don't know where the location of all these pitches were, so I don't know if he's just leaving stuff in the heart of the plate more often where guys are more likely to get on plane and make that contact and hit the ball at the right launch angle. And you can, if you know, you can touch on it. But
yeah, I mean, he was over the middle of the plate a lot last night. I think really like the Yastrzemski one is the one you can look at and be like, how was that one hit out? But otherwise, it was a lot of stuff leaking over the plate. That's just last night, though. I haven't looked at the whole stretch here. I did watch one video where Santiago Espinal like got to a cutter that was like just barely above the strike zone and he somehow still hit it out. Those are the ones where it's kind of like, is he really going to keep giving up home runs on these kinds of pitches? But I know last night it was a lot of plate for sure.
Yeah, last night for sure. And I do remember the Espinal one now that you say that. Even I think the India one that he gave up to end that outing wasn't the worst location to possibly throw a pitch, but it wasn't great either. But yeah, just I think that's more where it comes down to, like, if you're making mistake pitches, then they are more likely to hit them in the air and to hit them for that type of power and really drive the ball. Whereas if you're making a good pitch, they can still get a barrel to the ball, but it's a lot harder to get it, in the air with authority. It might be more of a low line drive or a grounder, especially with, his 3 fastballs and the way he can move around the zone to different quadrants and everything else. So my guess is that there's a decent level of bad luck to all of these leaving the yard, but that he is probably making more mistakes and that there's more opportunities for these guys to drive them. And sometimes you get in a rut where guys just take advantage of your mistakes. And it's something I've had even as a pitcher back in the day. Like sometimes it feels like you can get away with mistakes for a stretch and it just so happens that keeps happening. And then all of a sudden, every single time you throw a pitch where you don't want it, it seems like it gets smoked. And I'd imagine he's probably feeling that a little bit mentally right now. So I don't think this is indicative of what we're going to see from Colin Rea the rest of the season. I don't think he's going to give up 3 homers per 9 the rest of the year. And if he does, well, I think the playoff rotation plans would probably have to change at that point because this is not a guy you could put in a playoff game. But like I said, I don't really expect that. There's probably a level of bad luck, a level of just not executing as well as he did earlier in the year. And also, there's always going to be a couple cheap homers that get out over the course of a season. He probably avoided that for a long time this year, and now a Mike Yastrzemski one does just happen to barely clear the fence, and that can make things look bad in small samples too when you have a couple things like that happen. So I didn't look as deep into it, but that's just kind of how I would view it based off of what you said and what I do remember from these starts.
You kind of touched on what my follow-up question was going to be here to kind of wrap up this discussion on Colin Rea. I'll ask for your thoughts first. So these last, how many weeks do we got? Like 3.5 weeks until the start of the playoffs, give or take. I didn't count the days. But these remaining weeks of the regular season, is Colin Rea now in a spot where he has to actively pitch for a spot in the playoff rotation? Because it seemed like for the vast majority of the year, he was going to be the guy to get that number 2 start behind Freddie Peralta. But now in light of what's happened these last 6 outings, are these remaining outings suddenly an audition for him now? Does he now have to earn that playoff spot again? Is it no longer assumed?
I kind of think so. And it sucks for him, obviously, that it hasn't become just written in stone like it kind of looked like it was going to be written in pen, I should say. But I don't think he needs to be like the guy we saw a month and a half ago when we were like, oh, he's actually getting better, where his FIP was like as good as his ERA, and they were both in the 3s and all of that. I don't think he needs to be that guy the rest of the year, but I do think he needs to prove that he can be trusted at this time of year. And I know he's over his max innings in a major league season, but he did also throw this many innings or more in the minors, and I believe also when he went overseas for his year. So it's not that he's never done this in his career, but I do think it matters that he's at that point in his first time in the major leagues, reaching that number. I think it could be affecting something, and I think it's something the Brewers would probably have a little bit of concern about if the results still don't improve by a decent amount down the stretch here, and just wondering, like, he might just be worn out and we just can't trust him in a playoff game at this moment. So I do think he's at least somewhat auditioning. Like I said, I don't think he needs to be perfect or that he needs to go out and shove, but I think he needs to prove he can be the classic Colin Rea special type of guy where it's, 5 innings, 3 earned, 4 earned maybe on a bad day, and do that kind of consistently in his last, I don't know what it would be, maybe 4, 5 starts down the stretch, probably 4. That's probably that's what I'd be looking at. And my guess is it's what the Brewers will be looking at as well.
Classic Colin Rea. It feels like we're like walking through the different eras of Colin Rea. So now we got to go back to the classic era.
Yep.
From last
all
year.
In one season.
All in one season. Like, I think you're right, though. I think that's really just what you hope he gets back to. The 5 inning, 2 to 3 runs most times out. Because we've talked about this a lot. The main value of Colin Rea is that almost every time he takes the ball, you're in the game when he comes
Yeah.
out of the game. And that's really what's been the difference in basically the 2 blow-up starts. Like, that's even last year, we never really saw that from him, these games where the game is decided by the time he's out of the game.
Yeah.
Like, decided in a bad way, I should say. Like, maybe they have a huge lead when he comes out of the game, but the game has not been a decided loss basically by the time he comes out, and that's what we've seen now in 2 of these outings. The other ones have all been in that camp of, yep, he went out there, he ate some innings, he kept you in the game. And you're right. I think that's the baseline that the Brewers would just want to see him get back to, and hopefully he's able to do it. I think either way, it doesn't take away from the innings he did give them up to this point. And what's nice now is you're in a position where that rotation is a little deeper now than it was early on. So you don't necessarily need Colin Rea or need the same version of Colin Rea that you needed 3 months ago to stay afloat. But just for Colin's sake, it'd be nice to see him finish the season strong, earn a spot in that playoff rotation. We'll kind of find out in these final weeks how that all goes down. Sticking on the topic of Brewers pitching, in those first 2 games of that Rockies series, 30 strikeouts for the Brewers pitching staff. Frankie Montas and Tobias Myers both reaching double-digit strikeout totals. And these are guys who haven't necessarily struck out a ton of batters this year. I think they've both been roughly around league average with their K rates. And this is always an interesting discussion, or just an interesting question for me, because I think when you're covering one team, it's always easy to just analyze everything through the lens of that team. Like, you're only evaluating that team, your team, so to speak. But this is one that really stands out to me, and you look at it and you look at the Rockies, who the Brewers are playing in this series, and you kind of try to weigh how much of it was Montas and Myers pitching that well, how much of it was the Rockies just being terrible. I think it was a blend of both. Like, I think if Frankie Montas and Tobias Myers throw the ball the way they did against the Rockies, against a different team in that game, I think they still pitch well. I don't think they combined to strike out 21 guys or whatever it was. So that's my thought. I'm curious if you're kind of feeling similarly.
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, I do think they were both pitching really well in their starts. Like, it would have held up against most offenses and they would have done well. But the Rockies are the worst whiff team, I believe, in Major League Baseball in terms of swing and miss. So whenever you have a team like that and strikeouts pile up, it just kind of makes sense. I mean, the maths in that scenario. So I think it's both. I think both of them obviously did very well, but you do have to factor in the Rockies just not being a very good offensive team. And yeah, I mean, that is where losing a series to a team like that, who really struggled on the road this year offensively. I believe you tweeted it out, right? That they were a 78 WRC plus team on the road. It was somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it was because I think I tweeted it out in the context of the Freddie start. Like, they have a 76 weighted runs created plus on the road. They struggle away from Coors Field, and your number one starter couldn't get through 5 innings against them.
Yeah.
And I guess we didn't dive into that whole Freddie start a lot. I think my takeaway is, especially like once I got like removed from that game and kind of went back and looked at the numbers. Basically, he wasn't really hit hard. I know the hit total was up there, but he had like a 30% hard hit rate. There was a lot of swing and miss in there too. So when the quality of contact is good and the whiff rates are good, like normally you'd be like, okay, like he actually threw the ball pretty well. I think, again, it just came back to so many deep counts from non-competitive misses. I mean, he put himself in a spot where the pitch count went up really quickly, and all of a sudden you're in the 5th inning. You've dealt with a lot of base runners. You've put the leadoff guy on multiple times, and it's just I don't blame Pat Murphy for wanting to go to the pen there. But that's kind of a side tangent. That's the context in which I tweeted it out. I can let you get back to your point that you were trying to make.
No, you're good. I mean, that is good context. And I will just add, since we're talking about it, it just felt like early season Freddie, the issues we had with Freddie early on, where he wasn't giving up a ton of runs. Obviously, the Hobie 3-run homer that he allowed ended up tacking on 2 to Freddie's line, but it was just he was putting himself in a position where he could get them out, and against a team that we just talked about whiffs as much as anyone in the majors, and he just couldn't put people away as often, and he wasn't competitive with his misses. And like you said, I think the leadoff guy might have reached every inning against him. If not, I think only one where they didn't. So just always kind of putting himself behind the 8 ball in that start, which was very frustrating for a team that isn't a very good hitting team, especially on the road. But to bring it back to that point, now I kind of forgot where I was on that point, but either way, that team in general, they're just a bad offensive team is really what it comes down to. So it's a really bad offensive team, especially away from Coors, against 2 pitchers who are pitching well, but I don't think it would be smart to expect many double-digit strikeout games from guys like Frankie or from Tobias Myers. That's basically where I was trying to get with it.
With that, we got a couple more points we want to hit on before we dive into our first question. So if you've been listening to the pod throughout the year, I think you'll know that we tend to dive into a lot of strategy decisions, probably more than some people usually do or more than some people would like us to. But I think we've nitpicked Pat Murphy about as hardcore as anybody. We don't have any specific in-game decisions that are really specific to one game or one situation. But there's a couple tactical things that I want to talk about. And these are tactical things that we've seen from Pat Murphy within this last week that I like. I think he's doing the right thing here with both of these. So we do try to go both ways. We try to call it as we see it, good or bad. But these are 2 things that I've noticed that he's done throughout this last week that I like that he's doing. The first one is having a quicker hook for his starting pitchers. And we saw it, first of all, in Colin Rea's previous start before the Giants won, where he was pulled after 4 innings. I believe that was a St. Louis game. He walked in 2 runs in the first inning, but he settled in really nicely after that. Murphy still pulled him after 4. I think the pitch count was only at like 75. If you really wanted innings eater Colin Rea, he could have ate another inning for you, but he didn't send it back out there. He went to the bullpen. I believe he went to DL Hall after Rea.
Yes, that would have been
so.
That one.
And that's what kind of comes back to my point now. I think he's finally in a spot where he has the arms and just the capita, the capital of arms to start to manage things a little bit more along the lines of how he was talking in spring training. In spring training, he was talking about some pretty radical ways to manage his pitching staff in terms of how he's going to piece together innings, using tandem guys, maybe using bullpen games, limiting exposure to the third time through the order, not caring a whole lot about what the pitch count is at. I don't think he was able to do that as much because he had so many guys go down with injury. And you get to a point where you're needing innings. Guess what? Colin Rea's got to go 7 now if the pitch count has him in a spot where he could do it. Tobias Myers has to go 7 if the pitch count has him in a spot where he could do it. Joe Ross, even earlier in the year when he was healthy, in a spot where we're going to try to stretch him out a little more if the pitch count says he can do it. Aaron Civale, even Frankie Montas. But now you're finally at a spot where not only is your rotation filled out a little bit more, you have DL Hall's back in the bullpen, Aaron Ashby's back in the bullpen. Joe Ross has been moved to the bullpen now as another kind of bulk innings guy out of the pen. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, so he did it with Colin Rea, and then he did it with Aaron Civale in game 1 of that Giants series where he pulled him at like 60-something pitches. I actually wanted him to pull him not even bring him back out for that inning, but he brought him back out for a couple batters. But still, the general idea of what he was going for, even if I would have maybe not let him start the inning, the general philosophy of, I'm in a spot where I can afford to pull you sooner and go to the new matchup, even if your pitch count's good. I like the process. And I don't think it's a coincidence that 2 of those times he did it to bring in DL Hall, another guy who's a little more stretched out and is back in that bullpen now. But for me, he's finally in a spot where, and I haven't confirmed it. I should ask him when they get back to Milwaukee. But it seems like he's finally in a spot now where he has the arms and he has the pitching staff structure that he thought he was going to have for most of the year. You're also later in the year now, which helps a little bit too. You're not pacing workloads quite as much anymore for your relievers in particular. But still, like DL Hall hasn't thrown as many innings as the Brewers thought he was going to throw this year. Aaron Ashby hasn't thrown as many innings as the Brewers thought he was going to throw this year. So you can push these guys a little bit more now than you could have otherwise. But basically, he's got the guys now where he can be a lot more aggressive with those hooks. And I like that he's doing that. And for me, and this is finally the question I'll raise to you as well, I think this is a preview of how we're going to see him use some guys in October. I think when we get to October, it's going to become even more extreme.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I think there are some starts where it could be Aaron Civale, you got one time through the order, maybe. Like, I could see them doing that.
Yeah.
Civale, you got one time through the order, then you're done. Montas, you got one time through the order, then you're done. And I think he's in a spot now where he's starting to transition to that because he has the guys to do it. So I think this is a preview of October, don't you?
I 100% do. Yeah. I think I'm going to be very interested to see how they handle some of I think Freddie will be more of a traditional starter, but still with a pretty quick hook. I don't think they'll go into a Freddie start saying, hey, we're going one time through or two times max with Freddie. But I think they'll be prepared for that possibility and be able to bring someone in for him. I think the rest of the starters, that would mostly be the plan. I wouldn't be surprised to see them kind of combine what you're talking about with some of the stuff we saw early in the season with the openers, trying to get a starter so that he doesn't face the top of the order the first time through, and then he can get all the way through the lineup a second time, only seeing that top of the order once. And then you go to another bulk guy to try and get you a few. Like, they'll have those possibilities depending on how they form their roster, obviously. But I would imagine it's going to include quite a few guys, at minimum, the three we just talked about, in Ashby, Hall, and Ross, and possibly another starter who's not in the rotation. I could see them having one of them in the bullpen available to be a bulk guy as well. So I think it's 100% a preview of October. And I do think, well, first of all, I agree with everything you said. And I think also having that extra arm in September is helping things too. Just one more guy where you can afford to throw an extra pitcher in a game because you got one more ready for the next day and the day after and all of that. So this is definitely how I will hope they use their pitching staff in the playoffs. And it does seem like they're kind of preparing themselves for that by the way they're handling it right now. So I like it, and I definitely hope we see it in the playoffs.
Next thing I want to talk about before we get to our first question here has to do with now also how Pat Murphy's putting together the lineup. So it sure seems now like he's made a change that I think a lot of people were hoping to see for a while now. So Bryce Turang, starting on May 8th and running through September 6th, so the end of last week, about exactly a week ago from when this is going up. Every single start that Bryce Turang made from May 8th through the first week of September, every start that he made against a right-handed pitcher was in the leadoff spot. Like, he was the automatic leadoff guy against right-handed pitching. And we all know how much the performance has really fallen off for Bryce Turang. So since the start of July, I believe it is, he has a 530 OPS, and a lot of it was a really, really rough month of July, but he's been pretty bad in August and now September as well. His last two starts now against a right-handed pitcher have been in the 9-hole. He's now at the bottom of the lineup, and that does seem to be a change that Pat Murphy's made now. I think they have pulled that plug. Jackson Churio has obviously commanded playing time near the top of the order. He's been in the leadoff spot instead now. I know Garrett Mitchell is batting in the 2-hole for the Brewers in that third game against the Giants against a right-handed pitcher. So very curious to see how Murphy chooses to kind of rearrange things at the top a little bit, but it does seem to me now like Turang is out as the leadoff guy just based on what we've seen over the last few months. And it's kind of significant for me too, because Pat Murphy has probably been one of the most vocal Bryce Terang supporters throughout the year. Like he's always been in Bryce's corner all the way going back to spring training when he declared that he was going to make the quantum leap. So this isn't insignificant. That whether it was fully Murphy's decision or not, I don't know, but the buck does stop with him. He makes these calls on putting together the lineup, and they've pulled the plug on it now. It looks like Bryce Terang is no longer the leadoff guy against right-handed pitching.
Yeah, and that's the correct move to make. And like you said,
absolutely.
It does matter that Murph was willing to do this, because I did have a bit of worry in my head that there was going to be a thought of, proving himself right, I guess isn't the best way to say it, but he believes in Terang. He's made it very clear. And it had been a while where he'd been struggling, and I just had kind of resigned myself to the fact that I thought he was going to be leading off the rest of the season. It just felt like that was going to continue to be the case. It seems like after even just, like you said, July was horrible. Since August 1st, it's a 616 OPS, which is not good either. 73 WRC plus. Like he hasn't been good even in that stretch. And I'm guessing he tried to get him into September and see if he could get rolling. As weird as it is, it does seem like some hitters, like as the calendar turns, so does their play. Some guys, it's weird how that always seems to happen, but a lot of guys, it's like, oh, from August 1st to the end of August, he was good. And then as soon as September turned around, it's not a real thing, but it just feels like that happens. And I have a feeling a guy like Murph might believe in, oh, calendar flipped. Like, let's see if we can get him going. It wasn't a very good first week, and it seems like it's finally got to the point where there's no good reason to have him batting leadoff, and he can do good things in the 9 spot too. I don't even want to overlook, like, that's a good place for a guy to potentially lay down a bunt if needed, if it makes sense in that spot. It's a good place for a guy to even just bunt for a hit to try and get the top of the order up, even if there's 2 outs or something in that scenario. Like, I think it gives him a little bit more room to play his game down there rather than having to set up 2 and 3 and 4 at the beginning of the order. And now you could have a guy like Churio right behind you to lead off an inning if you get out, but also just it resets the lineup. And I think it puts him in a little bit of a better spot to play his game too. So it wouldn't shock me if he's a little bit better from that, not because he's hitting all that much better, just because it fits what the Brewers might need from him a little bit better. So yeah, it's good to see. Hopefully it's not just a random blip, but it feels unlikely now that it's been 2 in a row against righties.
I think this is a good way to kind of lead into one of the questions that we got from Seth Stows. He asked Pat Murphy and Ricky Weeks. So Murphy as the manager, Weeks as the associate manager. Do we think that these 2 guys were the right choices for the job? I think we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I also think that this is a good opportunity to just fully synthesize each of our thoughts on both of these guys in the jobs that they've been asked to do. Mainly Murphy, just because you see more of what he does up front. But I can kind of go first here. When the Brewers made the decision to just promote him from within, promote Pat Murphy from within, I didn't like it. I didn't think that was the right direction for them to go. I could understand the continuity aspect of it. I just didn't think he was going to be good enough as a baseball strategist in 2024 Major League Baseball to the point that he was the right guy, especially when you're trying to replace a very good strategic manager in Craig Counsell, a guy who was widely seen by many of his peers as one of the smartest tactical managers out there. And kind of as the season has unfolded and we sit here now on, it's September 12th when we're recording this, it'll be September 13th when people are first able to listen to it. But now as we're sitting here, here's what my thoughts are on Pat Murphy. I think that from the tactical side, in-game management, he is better than I thought he was going to be. And We talked about some of the stuff he's been doing recently, especially with the quick hooks lately, and the way that he was talking about managing his pitching staff going into the year. I was very impressed off the bat in spring training, just the first opportunity to talk to him and kind of hear him talk about his vision for the ball club and just kind of how he was going to approach the job. I came away very impressed by his willingness to be challenged, his willingness to take in new information to change the way that he does things. And we saw it come into play pretty early on. Like, he has been pretty radical with how he's maneuvered this pitching staff, and that's not an easy job. Spencer, you mentioned there was a stretch of time where he was using openers on the front end of games because that was how it needed to be. I mean, there were some things we didn't like along the way. I still think he was way too heavy with workloads for certain relievers in the early going. It seemed like a lot of times if a guy had the lead, it was we're going to go pedal to the metal, or if the Brewers had the lead, we're going to go pedal to the metal with our A guys in May already, at the risk of, potentially putting them in some not so great states in terms of the workload they've had to shoulder early on. I think he got better at that as the year progressed, and he got a lot better at pacing guys out. I think right now, I would still say that within the context of MLB managers in the year 2024, I wouldn't call him a good tactical manager. And important caveat to make here is a guy who's been around the game a long time. You don't get this job without being very baseball smart relative to the general population. Relative to MLB managers in 2024, I don't think he really stands out. I wouldn't call him a good tactical manager. I think he makes good moves and he makes bad moves. And every manager is going to make bad moves. And this is very hard to evaluate because you can't really quantify it. But just from watching a lot of Brewer games this year, I do think there have been a lot more moments where I'm kind of scratching my head a little bit by something he's done than there were in the past under Craig Counsell. So I don't think he's at that level in terms of a tactical manager in the big leagues in 2024. But one thing that has become very, very evident, and it became evident very early on, just how good he is in the clubhouse and just how good he is as a leader.
Yeah.
And he does it in a very humble way too. Anytime this comes up, he always says, well, it's not about me. He'll kind of deflect it to, well, it starts with the veteran guys. It's the veteran guys setting the tone. But then you hear the way his players talk about him, like, no, it is starting with Pat Murphy. Pat Murphy's setting the tone, and he's doing a damn good job of it. And I think if you're going to weigh the things that matter most as a manager, I think what the Brewers seem to be really blessed with Counsell in that for the majority of his tenure, they had both. His players really liked playing for him. He was a good communicator, and he was an excellent tactical manager. Now I think you've transitioned to a guy in Murphy who I would not say is on that same level as a tactical manager. I would say he's a few steps down from Craig, or from that upper tier of really good in-game management guys from a strategy standpoint. But I think you've moved on to a guy who is either just as good, if not better, at the interpersonal aspect of it. And I do think that if you're going to pick one side of a manager's job that matters more, I do think it is just the interpersonal aspect of it. You got to guide these guys through a 162 game regular season and the playoffs and spring training too. It really starts there. So, it's more like probably 200 games if everything goes according to plan that you have to guide these guys through. And he does do a very good job of that. So with that in mind, to finally answer your question, Seth, I do think now, just knowing what we know, that Pat Murphy was the right choice for the job. I think that the areas that I'm still not very sold on him, I think number one, he's been better than I thought he was going to be. But also number two, I think it just speaks to the value of the Brewers still being able to keep basically their entire coaching staff intact. Yes. Like all of these got Chris Hook, Connor Dawson, Ozzie Timmons, Quentin Berry, Matt Erickson now joining the big league staff as well. Charlie Green, Walker McKinven, all these guys. These are the guys who really do a lot of the nitty gritty strategy stuff that I think is the most impactful. And you can see the value of that, the value of all these guys staying on underneath Murphy. I think that the Brewers are a very well-oiled machine in terms of just all the parts that they have that make up this team and this coaching staff. And I think at the end of the day, when you weigh everything, Murphy comes out as a very, very good interpersonal ringleader of all that, as someone who can kind of tie it all together at the top. You know, even if I'm still not a huge fan of some of the strategy stuff or some of the ways he chooses to go about things, again, like there's a lot of it that has been a lot better than I thought it's been or thought it was going to be. But yeah, end of the line, I think the most important job that a manager can have, I think he excels on that front. So I think they made the right call, and you know, it's a little harder to see how Ricky Weeks contributes to all of that, but I will say about him, he's a guy who people were very impressed with his ability to communicate with players when he was on the player development side. That's why they kind of put him into this role. So we don't see as much of him up front, but I think kind of reading between the lines a little bit, he's very good at his job too, and I think he's a good guy to be grooming as maybe the next man up. But I don't think there's any reason to really be pushing Murphy out the door either. Like, you know, if things continue to go the way they have so far, he'll be here for the life of the 3-year contract he signed, and then maybe you pass the baton. But I think you do have overall a pretty solid core of guys to have running the ship here. And I think now looking back, out of all the choices the Brewers realistically had, I do think they went the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. It's very hard for me to add too much to what you said because you pretty much nailed it. I think in terms of like the way the players talk about Murph, it's a lot of phrasing along the lines of like, we want to go to war for this guy and with this guy. And well, I think Craig always got a lot of praise for obviously his ability to communicate. Pitchers especially loved it. Hitters loved how they knew when they were going to be off, when they knew when they were going to be potentially used in certain situations. Like a lot of them talked him up for that reason. And it sounds like Murph has a lot of those same abilities, which he probably learned by being next to Counsell for as long as he was. And he's mentioned a number of times that he learned a lot from those years as a bench coach, which I can tie back to Ricky soon. But I do think in terms of the way players talk about Murph, it's different than Counsell, where they do genuinely like feel this need to go out and perform for him, and the way they talk about it, you just didn't hear that same type of phrasing for Counsell. So you said as good or better. I do think he's better than Counsell in that regard. And I don't think, again, that is not a knock on Counsell because he was very good at it, and he probably still is with the Cubs right now. But I think there's a different level for Murph in that regard. And yeah, I won't rehash everything we talked about all year with all the moves and everything, but it's gotten better. I still think it can improve. He is a first time, other than a interim tag, a first time manager. Like, he improved over the course of this year. I would be willing to bet, given his extreme open-mindedness and the way he does seem to learn from certain mistakes he makes. And we haven't had too many things that we've talked about a bunch of times. Usually it's, different things that pop up over the course of the season, but he hasn't repeated the same mistake outside of a few, or I guess I shouldn't even say mistake, but decision that we didn't agree with too often. And it does seem like he learns from those types of things pretty well. So over the course of whatever it is, maybe the next 2 years, maybe if he's still up to it at his age at that point, maybe it does go beyond 3 years on this deal. But I would imagine he will continue to get better at it. And that's genuinely a huge credit to him as a person and as a manager. At his age, to improve over the course of a season is not easy. Like, a lot of people his age would be pretty set in their ways. And he definitely, while he of course has certain things that are probably pretty non-negotiable, he's pretty open to new ideas and doing different things. Like you said, the opener early in the season, now going to the relievers earlier. I think the way he's handled some of the offensive matchups were at times, I think, better than how Counsell did it in his time here. So I absolutely think it was the right decision, and I am in the same boat where I didn't think it was at the moment, and I'm very happy to be wrong about that. I think the one name I always would have wanted was Joe Espada, and in the end, he didn't move. He wasn't leaving the Astros. So of all the other names, there weren't a ton that super stood out to me. I had my concerns about Murph, and I probably would have been happier in the moment with other decisions. But I think I've been proven wrong, and I'm very happy to say that. I do think he's overall not very good, but I think he's a good manager, and that's important to just be at that level and not be hurting your team, which is the other way it can go. Really, you either help or you hurt your team as a manager, and I think he helps it. So that's how I would wrap it up. But yeah, on Weeks, I guess the only thing I'll say is it's cool to see him on the bench because Ricky Weeks was a fun player during my childhood. I have no idea what all goes into his job, what he's actually doing. I know the players do like him. You can see him conversing with some of the young guys, especially when they come off the field, especially after maybe a tough at bat or something like that. You do see him on TV sometimes talking to those guys kind of in the tunnel there. So my guess is he mostly works with the younger guys because that was what they brought up at the press conference, his ability to kind of relate to some of those guys. He was a huge prospect at one point. He's gone through a lot of what these guys are going through as a player. So that would be my guess as to where the most value comes in from him right now. And that's really helpful to have somebody who's been in that spot who can walk in their shoes and he knows what they've gone through. So I would say he was probably the right choice as well. That we have less knowledge on what else was available and all the options that were there. And but I think at the very least, it was a good choice. So yeah.
Moving on to our next question that we're going to take. Russell's Branyan asked us on Twitter, does the Brewers offense struggle against opposing starters? It feels like they do, but nothing matters besides the actual numbers. So he asked, where do the Brewers rank among the rest of the league against starting pitching? This can be a quick one. The Brewers, entering Thursday night, have the 8th highest OPS in baseball against starting pitchers. So it's really not been an area of struggle for them this year. Their OPS is 13th against relievers, so they're a little closer to middle of the pack there, but that doesn't surprise me. That's just generally a league-wide trend. Relievers are usually going to be a little bit more effective than starters. I think that gap has closed a little bit in recent years, but if you still look kind of team by team, there are a lot of teams that do quite a bit worse against relievers than they do against starters, because a lot of times the guys who are full octane, high leverage relievers, they're going to be coming at you with some better stuff than, maybe the number two, or not number two, number 3, 4, 5 type starters you're going to see throughout the regular season who are just there to eat up innings. You're going to see more volume from those guys. They're just generally not as high octane pitchers. The stuff isn't as consistently elite for those guys. So you're going to hit starting pitching more, but it's not really an area of concern for the Brewers. So you can rest easy about that. Mason asked us on Twitter, switching to the pitching side of things, what are the changes the Brewers have made, subtle or obvious, to what Aaron Civale and Frankie Montas are doing to turn them into effective starters? So I know I've talked about both of these guys a little bit. I'll start with Civale because I actually have a little more direct knowledge on that one. I wrote, I believe it was last week, about how over his last 4 or 5 starts, it was basically it started when the Brewers were in Atlanta. He kind of had an in-depth meeting with some members of their pitching development team. I think Chris Hook seemed to be pretty prominently involved in that discussion. And one of the things that they brought up to him was, we want you to start throwing your shorter slider again that you used to throw on top of the other 2 breaking balls you throw. So a few years ago, Civale, when he was with Cleveland, was still had the curveball, obviously, and then he had a slider that was a little bit harder. It broke kind of like in that 8 to 10 inch range laterally. Once he went to the Rays, they traded out that slider for a sweeper, which is just a bigger, longer slider that relies on side spin more to get bigger breaks. So that breaks instead now usually like 17 to 20 inches for him laterally. And Chris Hook basically told me when I asked about it for this story, the Brewers, when they saw Civale, they kind of looked at just how all of his pitches play together and work together and how they move, and they saw a gap. So what would really stood out about Civale to the Brewers and kind of what makes him tick and what they knew could make him tick was that he just gets so much coverage in terms of how he can make the ball move. He can make the ball move just about any way you can imagine. He's got the running two-seamer. He's got the four-seamer with a little bit of carry to it. He's got the cutter, which is just a fastball that's going to move glove side a little bit to the opposite direction of the two-seamer. Then he's got the curveball that's got the big vertical movement, the sweeper that's got the big lateral movement. He's got a splitter he uses once in a while. But they saw a little gap there on the breaking ball side of things because they're like, okay, he's got two really big breaking balls, one that has big movement depth-wise, another that's got big movement laterally. And basically they said, hey, we want you to bring this shorter slider back because that can kind of plug that hole a little bit. Now you've got a little bit of a bridge between your two breaking balls, and you've also got a bridge between the cutter and the sweeper as well. So if you're going to throw something that moves to the glove side, basically the money quote from Chris Hook in that story I wrote is he's got short, medium, long. He's got something that moves to the glove side that's short, the cutter, something that moves to the glove side that's medium, the slider, and then something that moves to the glove side that's longer, which is the sweeper. So basically they just feel like he's got full coverage now. But I think what's really made the bigger impact for him, and this was something that Hook had mentioned to me as well, just from a mechanical standpoint, they feel like he's getting into his front foot better now, and he's releasing the ball out in front more. And when you're releasing the ball out in front more, that can give you some of that later movement. The ball is just going to come out of your hand a little bit crisper. It can be harder for the hitter to pick up as well because they can't see it as early on, as opposed to if you're kind of releasing the ball back here instead of when you're way out front. It can help you command the ball better. It just kind of has a lot of ripple effects on how, number one, you're able to locate the ball, how it behaves out of your hand, how hitters see it out of your hand. So basically, with those two things combined, he's generating a lot more deception than he was early in the year, and that's what's really helped him out. As far as Montas, I haven't really done a whole lot of digging into that one, but I know early on the Brewers had him throwing a lot more fastballs, just the general fastball variation. He's also throwing harder too. Yeah. But I'd be willing to bet there's probably some kind of mechanical tweak he's made. I haven't looked into it, but these guys are always tinkering. And Chris Hook, one thing I've learned, is very good at the biomechanical side of this as well. You know, people talk about using the analytics for pitch mix stuff and all of that, or maybe kind of tweaking with the movement of the ball out of the hand. But he's very, very good at applying the biometric stuff, the biometric data that they're able to collect on these guys. And he's very good at helping them use that to make mechanical tweaks, use their bodies the best way that they can. So I'd be willing to bet that's kind of what's going on with Montas as well. But that's my insider info tangent. Spencer, is there anything else that you have just kind of seen from watching these guys as to what could be making them a little bit more effective?
No, I mean, I don't have much more to add. I was going to say on Montas, I think the velo jump has definitely helped a little bit, just helping the fastball play up. I think using all three variations of the fastball a little bit more often has helped too, just to keep hitters off balance. Because if you're throwing mid to upper 90s with three different fastballs, I do think that even plays up a little bit more than a guy like Rea, who might be low 90s or maybe touching 94, 95 on a really good day. I think it allows a little bit more room for error and also makes it even harder for hitters to pick up on which variation of the fastball is coming in that situation. So, the one thing that'll always be interesting to me is just there was one start not too long ago that Montas broke out the splitter a decent amount, but I can't remember which one it was. But either way, it's just kind of crazy that felt like, to me, the thing that was probably going to be what helped him the most. And it seems like actually going away from it has been one of the bigger helps for him as a Brewer. So I don't have too much to add. I will say on the Civale getting the ball out in front thing, as a hitter, a lot of times you're kind of taught the easiest way to pick up a breaking ball is to see it pop out of the top of the hand. It's a lot harder to do that on pitches that are out in front. So that can make a really big difference. And that doesn't even necessarily mean hitters would be driving Civale breaking balls because they saw it but it does mean it'd be easier for them to take it and to be able to recognize it and lay off of it and not go after it. So if you can get it out in front and just make it a little bit harder to pick it up in general, like Jack said, and give them less time to do it and maybe get a little bit later movement, that could be a really big part of it. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got on those two.
The last thing I'll say on this one is it seems to me like on the pitching side, two things the Brewers really emphasize with guys they pick up or kind of how they tweak things a little bit for guys. It's all about, number one, how do we maximize deception? And then number two, just having adaptability. Those seem to be the two traits that they really like to focus on. Like, that's just my takeaway now from, number one, just following this from afar for a few years, and now this year getting to talk to some guys. Like, everything that they seem to adjust, like with Civale, the adjustment was all about generating more deception by adding that slider, getting out in front with the ball a little more. The three fastball guys, there's a lot more deception if you're throwing three different kinds of fastballs that out of the hand are going to look like they're spinning exactly the same to the hitter, but they're moving in different directions. And that separation is usually going to be pretty late too, because they're all fastballs. So I stuff like that. I mean, even I know Trevor McGill, like the making the curveball shorter was his own idea by the time he came to the Brewers. But again, like if you're throwing the curveball harder now, you're cutting a little bit of that vertical drop off of it. Guess what? There's more deception there because it's not going to separate from the fastball until later versus when he was with Minnesota, it separated a lot sooner. So like just different things like that. It really, a lot of it does seem to be about just how can we be as deceptive as possible. And then just the adaptability of it as well. If you have guys like Civale who can tweak their pitch mix a little based on the matchup, or you have a Frankie Montas who, hey, if we got guys who are going to be aggressive in the strike zone, but not very aggressive outside of the strike zone, we'll pound them with the three fastballs. And then when we're facing the Rockies, break out the splitter more because the Rockies will chase and they'll go after the splitter, just things like that. And I don't think that's entirely unique to the Brewers. That's just pitching in general. But the Brewers do a very, very good job of not only emphasizing those things, but also having a game plan for each of these pitchers to maximize that. And I think that's really where you see just some of even these subtle upticks when guys get here. So the Brewers are very good at what they do on that front. And I will note with like Civale, especially, the peripherals really haven't gotten a whole lot better for him. So I don't know that he's going to maintain where he's at right now. But still, there are a couple things that they have changed there that do make him at least a touch better than he was before he got here. And sometimes just the incremental upgrades can add a lot of value in the long run, especially for a guy who's just meant to be eating innings, basically. And I think that's kind of what you see with him. Next question we'll take comes from Patrick, who asked us a couple different things. First, he asked us about Garrett Mitchell. He says, I know you guys have your concerns about Garrett Mitchell. He does as well. And he knows that this is a little bit of a stretch based on their profiles, but he asks if Mitchell's ceiling is the Marlins version of Christian Yelich. So to kind of add some context here, the Marlins version of Christian Yelich was basically a high on base, speed, 15 homer a year type guy.
Yeah.
And I guess part of it depends on how do you want to define ceiling. Like, are you thinking semi-realistic ceiling, or are you, by saying ceiling, do you mean like what he's truly capable of if he figures everything out? Because if it's the latter, I would say his ceiling is higher than that.
Yeah.
Because there's the raw strength that he has and the raw power he has. He can hit more than 15 home runs a year if he can get the ball off the ground.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, I think the pure ceiling isn't that different from like a guy like Yelich in his best seasons, because Yelich, I do see similarities here. Like, I think this is actually somewhat reasonable. I do think the strikeouts is the difference here in the whiff compared to Marlins Yelich. But a guy who hits hard ground balls and hard low line drives and probably more of a gap to gap power guy, but clearly has the strength to hit home runs. A lot of that aligns between Mitchell and Yelich. Like, there's a lot of similarities there from Marlins Yelich, I should say. And even like the version we saw in 2023 of Yelich. But that strikeout and the whiff that's still different. That's where it's going to need to change. And if you can get into elevating the ball a little bit more, then you do have that type of potential to be legitimately an all-star level, if not even better type of player. Like that's what, as much as we've always talked about our concerns about Mitchell and why we don't necessarily believe a ton in him, but every time we do it, both of us will note, but the ceiling and the actual potential here is as high as almost anyone in the organization, including pretty much everyone but Churio. And even if you really want to talk pure ceiling, then it's probably pretty close to Churio. It's just more likely that Churio actually reaches that ceiling. So I think it's not a bad comp, honestly, but the one caveat is always going to be the swing and miss. And it'll always be our biggest concern with him and why we kind of doubt that he ever does reach anywhere near that ceiling that he does have.
Bringing up Churio leads pretty well into the next question he had for us. So he asked if we think it's reasonable to believe Churio can improve his walk rate in the future. I'm going to say yes, because I think we're already seeing it happen. He's been pitched around a little bit more lately, and he's not taking the bait. He's letting those pitches go, and he's okay with taking the walks. So I think this just, again, ties back to his adaptability and just how smart of a baseball player he seems to be already for a guy who's 20 years old playing in the big leagues. I definitely think he's got the capability to draw more walks if he realizes that's just kind of where things are at right now. I think he's always going to be a guy who, when he's seeing pitches in the strike zone, he's going to have the most success by being aggressive on those pitches in the strike zone because he is such a good hitter and he's got such great bat speed, such incredible hands. But I also think he will have the frame of mind to not get too aggressive when pitchers aren't giving him those pitches to hit. And I think we're already kind of seeing the seeds of that starting to sprout a little bit. So it's going to come down to a couple things like how are pitchers attacking him, how much protection does he have in the lineup.
Yeah.
But for me, it's if he's in a position where he does need to walk more, where like that's just the path for him based on the kind of pitches he's seeing, I think he can do it.
Yep. I was pretty much going to say the same thing. I think it's going to be a matter of recognizing when pitchers are actually going after him and when they're not. And like you said, I think over the last month or so, he started to recognize a lot more that, yeah, especially even more recently, they're pretty willing to walk me if I don't go after stuff because, frankly, unfortunately for the Brewers, he is one of the few threats in the order right now. And while Willie and William are pretty good protection, it's still to the point where I think teams probably fear Churio as much as any of them at the moment. And yeah, they're in a lot of scenarios and even just understanding scenarios in that moment, like second and third with a base open and 2 outs, they're probably not going to give me a pitch to hit here. I'm looking for one spot. I'm looking to drive a ball if I get it early in the count, but I got to understand here that, I'm probably going to get a breaking ball off the plate here, and they want to see if I can get myself out. And I think he's starting to already adjust to that because, like we said, he just does that. He adjusts at an insane level that, frankly, most people in their primes don't do. And at 20 years old, he's able to do so. We've talked about it a lot, but I do think it's the most impressive part of his game to me is the ability to adjust at his age. It's the most uncommon of everything else. There's a lot of very talented players in baseball. There aren't that many at his age who just seem to be able to completely change what they're doing on the fly and have a different mindset and a different approach and understand why they're doing it and how to do it. It's pretty special. So I do think we'll see a higher one. I don't think it'll ever be huge. I don't think he'll ever be a guy who's walking at like a 15% rate over the course of a season or anything. But I think getting, in that double digit range, I do think that'll happen over the course of his career.
Another question he's got relates to the postseason lineups. So he asks, how do you see those stacking up? Offense over defense, given every starter you face in the playoffs is above average to elite. He just says that he had a hard time really envisioning a guy like Jake Bauers, for example, getting 3 to 4 at bats a game just for the defensive side of it. Just kind of asking, do you roll with just the best offensive group instead? Spencer, I know you were kind of excited about this question, so I can let you take this one first.
Yeah, honestly, the Bowers part of this is something I've been thinking about myself recently. So I was excited to get this question because I had already kind of had it in my head. I do think at that particular spot, and this would be a tough move to make, I think, but I think Bowers playing first against righties would make a lot more sense than maybe the average fan or most people would think. In terms of, if you look at their season-long stats at this point, Rhys Hoskins has a 94 weighted runs created plus. Jake Bowers is 89. To me, that is not a big enough differential to be able to say we need to put Rhys in this lineup. Absolutely need to, and we'll live with the much worse defense. I think the Brewers most likely in the playoffs are going to have to win with somewhat low-scoring games, and a Rhys Hoskins at first base could cost them multiple runs in a game pretty easily, in my opinion. He's done it a number of times over the course of the season. Against the lefty, I think Rhys has to be in the lineup. I would not put Jake Bowers in there in that scenario because I think there's a big enough discrepancy in the offense that way, even though Rhys hasn't been great against lefties. He really hasn't. That was a big part of why he was signed, and he hasn't been. But I do think you probably put him in there against lefties. I would probably start Bowers against righties, and I think it would probably annoy a lot of people. I would not hit him as high in the lineup as he has been in some of these starts that he's been making. He would not be my 3-hitter no matter how I lined up against or lined up the rest of the order, but it's hard for me to justify being able to put Rhys out there when he just really hasn't been hardly any better offensively. And there is a level of, Rhys is hitting the playoffs. He does seem to have, as much as I don't fully believe in this, he does seem to come up in big moments a decent amount, which over the course of a career, if a guy does it, I kind of start to buy in a little bit more to him actually just being able to I think what that comes down to is being able to calm your heart rate and being able to kind of not let the moment get too big for you rather than actually stepping up in that moment. I think it's more about not falling down in that moment. That's kind of how I view clutch players, as guys who can stay relaxed in that moment. And I do think Rhys probably has that ability. But it'd be really hard for me to watch Rhys Hoskins in the infield, and I could just very easily see mistakes at first base costing the Brewers runs in games that are probably going to be very close over the course of the playoffs. But I would say the rest of the lineup, I would largely lean towards offense, mostly because I don't think there's much of a discrepancy in the defense at the other positions. I think all the outfielders can play good defense. All of the infielders, I mean, Monasterio for me would not start a playoff game under any circumstances. Even if there's a lefty on the mound, I'd rather have Terang at second in that spot because I just don't think Monasterio's adding more. So I think as long as there's not much of a discrepancy in the offense, you go with the defense. But otherwise, I would lean towards offense outside of first base. So that's the big one for me is Bowers, and that's the one I was thinking about. So Jack, you might disagree with this. We have not talked about this at all, but I'm curious your thoughts on this.
I mean, what I come back to is, so if Bowers plays first, Rhys DHs, so he's playing anyway. Is there anyone you'd rather give those DH at bats to and then put Jake Bowers on the bench? I think that's what a lot of the question comes down to.
True.
And I don't know if they'll do it, but I could see, just with how aggressively Pat Murphy talks about the win tonight mentality, I could see him once he gets into a playoff series just wanting to put everyone he perceives to be the best hitter in there.
Yeah.
Maybe a little more so than defense. I think it's going to come down to who's pitching as well. Like when Freddie Peralta is pitching game one, I don't think Jake Bowers is going to play.
No.
If you have more of a ground ball guy in the mound, I think there's a good chance we do see him in there. On just the general roster construction front, and this does play into offense over defense a little bit. I was on 97.3 The Game a couple days ago, and they asked me if there could be kind of a surprise addition to the playoff roster, and they asked, like, is Tyler Black someone who can make the cut? I think he is. If you're in a series where you're facing a lot of right-handed pitchers, you're stacking
Yeah.
up a team against a team that has a lot of righties. I could see him making a playoff roster over Andrew Monasterio.
Yeah.
Like I could very easily see that happening, because I think in that context, you're like, I think we need the left-handed bat off the bench more than we need Monasterio, especially if you think about it, your roster is, you have Adames at shortstop, Bryce Duran can play shortstop, Joey Ortiz can play shortstop. Also, just generally, you're probably not subbing those guys out for anyone. If there's an injury, then you can put Monasterio on the roster as an injury replacement. But I think that's one where you could maybe see more of an offense over defense roster construction type move. And then you kind of make that change later on if you need to, be it due to injury or whatever, just the needs of the matchup you have in that series or the next. But specific to Bauers, I think it's kind of up in the air. I think he'll make a playoff roster. I don't think he's, they're going to keep him off a playoff roster or anything like that. But it is an interesting discussion. There are a couple different ways they could go with it. I'm inclined to think that that Murphy may not want to start him unless he absolutely has to. And what's the bar for that, or the threshold for that? I'm not entirely sure, but it's an interesting discussion. We'll find out in a few weeks how exactly the Brewers want to roll that out. With that, we will transition to our one injury update, and Oli Paredes was activated from the 60-day IL ahead of Thursday's game. Elvis Peguero was optioned, and Rob Zastryzny was bumped to the 60-day IL. We have not heard anything about Rob Zastryzny for a few weeks now, paused his rehab assignments. I didn't double check, Spencer. He hasn't thrown in any minor league games since that, right? And that was like 3 weeks ago. So,
yeah,
I don't think we're going to see Rob Zastryzny again. Did give the Brewers some quality. What did he end up pitching? Like 10 innings or something in July, August.
Yeah.
So he gave the Brewers some quality innings, opened a few games for him, but his season is most likely over with the news that he's bumping to the 60-day IL. It does bring us to one more question from Seth, who also asked us about calling up Jacob Mizorowski or Craig Yoho. This is another bullpen transaction that has gone by. There have been quite a few bullpen moves in the last few weeks, but none of them involving Jacob Mizorowski or Craig Yoho. So he asks, are we surprised that the Brewers haven't called them up? I'm not. I think we talked about it a few times, like making a case for it, or maybe which guy we would expect to see up first if they do go there. I think it was always going to come down to whether or not the need was there, and I just don't think it's been there, especially now that, like we talked about before, Aaron Ashby's back in the mix, and he's looking like a high leverage playoff reliever, or like a bridge the gap guy between these short starts and the back end of the bullpen. DL Hall's looking like one of those guys as well. Like I don't think the need is there right now. And if the need is not that pressing, I don't think the Brewers were going to push it. I think that both of these guys are probably not coming up at this point. Yoho in particular has slowed down at least a little bit in Nashville. We're seeing the walk start to catch up with him a little bit more. Mizorowski definitely looks big league ready, but I just don't know that we're going to see him based on the way things are shaking out right now. But I'm personally not all that surprised.
No, I'm not surprised. I think if you told me 3 or 4 weeks ago that by mid-September, neither of them would be up, I would have been a little surprised. But based on how everything has played out over the course of time, and guys like Paredes coming off the IL at a time where, they could use a pitcher, it just hasn't really worked out to a point where it makes much sense. And like Jack said, I think it needed to be more of a pressing need. And also, I think it needed to be a spot where they felt they didn't have enough playoff level pitchers and they needed to find another one. And that's why they were going to bring one of these guys up to say, we need to find out if we can make them one of our playoff pitchers. And right now, I think they're already going to be kind of struggling to figure out which ones to not put on their playoff roster more than anything else in the bullpen of the options they have. So I think it would have to happen very soon if it happens at all, because they would want them to get some major league experience. But I think the only way it does happen is if there's another injury to probably an important reliever. And obviously we do not want that to happen. So yeah, it feels unlikely and not super shocking to me at this point. But like I said, I think I would have been surprised if you told me a month ago that neither of them would be up by this point. Just the way it shook out, it makes sense to me now.
It's a good opportunity for us to pivot to Spencer's minor league sandbox, where Spencer can go walk through everything that is happening in the minor leagues. Are Jacob Mizorowski and Craig Yoho part of this roundup this week?
They are not. Nope. They're not.
Well, let's find out who is part of this week's roundup. Take it away.
Yeah, so on the pitching side of things, I wanted to go with a few guys that I haven't talked about at any point. I suppose the first two I probably talked about a little bit post-draft because they're both 2024 draft picks from the Brewers for the Brewers, but both of them made their debuts at Low A, Carolina within the last couple of weeks. So the first one is Chandler Welch. He was the 6th round pick this season out of Tulane. He's a 6-pitch guy. He's only thrown in one game. He went an inning and 2/3. He struck out 3. He didn't walk anyone. He gave up 2 hits. He picked a guy off a second. I was watching this appearance because I wanted to see how he looked with a pretty nice inside move. Definitely seems like kind of one of those heady pitchers. He was definitely doing a good job of holding runners and mixing timing and doing all that stuff well. He's a 6-pitch guy, and from a minor league camera, it can be tough to separate fastballs sometimes, but he does throw a 4-seam and a sinker. And in college, a pitch that was classified as a slider, but to me looks a little bit more like a cutter. And I believe he calls it a cutter as well. And then he also throws a sweeper, a curveball, and a changeup. The sweeper looked really good. The curveball looks solid. I think the changeup's definitely the 6th pitch out of the grouping. But something the Brewers have been able to often, a lot of pitchers, they've been able to get their changeup to be passable. And as a 6th offering, I think that's really all it needs to be. But in those inning and 2/3, he did have a whiff rate of 47%. That's a tiny sample, but at least gives you an idea that his stuff can generate some swing and miss. The second guy is Mason Molina. He was the 7th round pick out of Arkansas. Lefty arm. He's made 2 appearances with Carolina. He's gone a total of 5 innings with 6 Ks, 1 walk, 4 hits, no earned runs. He really gives me like Ethan Small vibes, but in a 7th round pick instead of a 1st rounder, which means there's a little bit more value there and probably less expectation on him. But I think there's something here. It's a low 90s fastball, even in like the 89 range at times, but it gets a ton of ride, really good shape, over 20 inches of induced vertical break. And he has a really good changeup. So both of those kind of line up with Small. I would say his slider is actually a little bit better at this stage than Small's was when he was in the low minors. So I think Molina's pretty interesting. He's a guy who was ranked on a lot of the pre-draft boards from all of the different sites. And I don't want to speculate too much, but I know this was talked about in college too. So he did get himself a bit out of shape at the end of his college career. I think he could benefit from being in a bit better shape and potentially add a little bit more velo to his just to what he's doing right now. I think he's a guy who should be able to get into that like 93, 94 range consistently if he can just rotate and move a little bit better. So it'll be interesting to watch, but definitely an interesting arm. One more that I've never talked about and frankly wasn't super on my radar, but Melvin Hernandez, he was signed in last year's international class. He's 18 years old as of only 2 months ago. He's 5'11". He weighs 139 pounds, which is, I mean, that is, the wind could blow him off the mound. Talking about Molina being out of shape, I think Melvin, maybe they could trade a little bit of that weight. But Melvin in Low A, Carolina so far has gone 6 innings, 7 strikeouts, 1 walk. He's given up 7 hits. Decent whiff, but not a ton. But the fastball has some really nice run and some sink on it. You could see from one of the camera angles, especially in his 2 outings. But it also seemed to be kind of heavy, and it worked pretty decently up in the zone. It kind of reminded me a little bit of like the Brandon Woodruff fastball, where it has that kind of shape, but it still can get past people up top. Difference is Hernandez throws about 89 to 91. We didn't get many readings from the announcers, and this wasn't one of the broadcasts or the 2 broadcasts that show miles per hour on their scoreboard. I will say this, just a quick tangent. If you are announcing minor league games, it would be very nice of you to throw out radar gun readings a little bit more often than some of the people do, especially if you're not broadcasting it on the screen. I think that's something a lot of people are listening for when they are watching a game or listening to a game. But tangent aside, he threw a really good changeup and a pretty decent looking slider. And then he also seemed to mix a curve in. It's hard to tell from those angles sometimes if it's just a slider in 2 different shapes or whatever. But he gets really good rotation in his mechanics. So if you imagine Jared Koenig and how well he rotates and how quickly, it kind of reminds me of that. And then for my other minor league nerds, it's kind of a Steven Cruz type of delivery, another Brewers pitching prospect. But moving on to the offensive side, don't have a ton here, but first round pick Braylon Payne, he played in his first few games at low A. He was the youngest player at the level. He only turned 18 a few weeks back. 19 plate appearances in the regular season. He slashed 438, 526, 625 for an 1151 OPS. He walked 3 times to 3 strikeouts. In 1 game, he had 4 hits and 4 stolen bases. And he's already shown exit velocities of 103, 104, and 110, which 110 I was not expecting at all. This looks like a guy who could be quite good. He had some chase above the zone so far. I think his bat playing kind of allows him to get to fastballs at the top and even above. So I think he might be a little aggressive because he thinks he can get to all of them. He basically tomahawked a pitch 104 miles per hour to center field in his 2nd or 3rd game. This ceiling is fun. I after looking into him more post draft, like I definitely got why they made the pick they did. After seeing him play, like he looks like he belongs in full season ball as a barely turned 18-year-old, and he has a little bit of swag to him in the box. I get the pick a lot, and I think he's already rising for some of like the prospect people after being able to get their eyes on him. I know Aram Layton from Just Baseball was talking about him on their podcast either a day or 2 days ago, and just kind of how impressive he's been so far. Another name we've talked about a lot, Yadier Arenamo. The Timber Rattlers are in their playoff series right now. He hit a solo home run in what ended up being a 1-0 victory. The homer left the bat at 106 miles per hour. Power had been a concern for him, and he's showing an ability to drive the ball pretty decently this year, so that's been really nice to see. Ernesto Martinez Jr., since August 15th, he's slashing 349, 423, 698 for an 1121 OPS. That's a 223 WRC plus, and he has 5 homers in that time. He's just been mashing. He's a guy the Brewers are probably going to consider protecting on the 40-man. He would be a minor league free agent this year if they don't. I have a feeling they might try to make him like their next Jake Bauers type project in next year's team. It's kind of a similar profile, but he does not strike out much at the AA level, and very aggressive swing, pretty big raw power, very solid defender. I could see them giving him a shot. And then, of course, I got to touch on Jesus Mate because he just keeps getting more and more hype. His season ended a while ago, but we got some more stats courtesy of Baseball America just to highlight how incredible he was as a 17-year-old. His 90th percentile exit velocity was 104.2 miles per hour, which is absolutely ridiculous for a 17-year-old. His in-zone miss rate this year was only 9.6%. Again, on its own, very impressive. Combined with hitting the ball that hard, pretty ridiculous. And he only chased at 14.9% of the time. So this is not a combo you see very often where guys can drive the ball, they don't chase, and they don't and they don't miss the bat often in zone or out of zone. He's getting huge hype. Baseball America said in this write-up that it might seem like hyperbole, but Mate has all the makings of a future number 1 overall prospect. And scouts and the data both back that up in the DSL. He just got crazy reviews by pretty much all accounts. So this might be, if you're dreaming on another Churio somehow coming through, it's very early. It's way too early to call this, but this is the guy to watch. He could be that level of prospect. He has that ability in him. So very exciting. I mean, we'll be following him all offseason. I'd imagine he starts at low A Carolina next year, but it's pretty fun to have this type of hype surrounding a prospect. As soon as Churio graduates, a new one moves in for the hype train, but there are no new minor league injuries to report. So, Jack, you can come back in. We can finish with our little preview of the D-back series and wrap this up.
So the Brewers will wrap up their road trip by going to Arizona for a 3-game set with the Diamondbacks. This is going to kick off a stretch of pretty critical games that could have some implications on the playoff race. Milwaukee will play Arizona on the road, then come back home, play Philly, and then play Arizona again. Here are the probables that are currently listed for that series. Friday night will be an 8:40 Central first pitch. Freddie Peralta is going to be on the bump opposite Eduardo Rodriguez. Tobias Myers will start against Brandon Pfaadt on Saturday. That's a 7:10 first pitch. And then DL Hall is listed as the probable starter on Sunday against Zach Gallen. That's a 3:10 first pitch. My guess is just with this stretch of games that the Brewers are playing, what is it, like 13 in a row or something? Whatever this run is that they're on, a good time to slide Hall back into that rotation and then push some guys back a little bit just so that guys aren't being overworked during this stretch. But those are the probables listed right now for that series. We'll be back with you next week to recap all of that action as well as any happenings from that Phillies series. Until then, thank you all for listening. Playoff races heating up now. We should have some, hopefully, fun things to talk about next time. Either way, should be a pretty eventful week. Until then, though, go Brewers.